All right, I'm here with Paul, and Paul got in touch with me. Oh, was that about a month ago or so?
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, and in response to watching some of the videos that I've been putting out, and had some really interesting insights to share. So, would you mind first saying a little bit about yourself, Paul?
Sure, sure. I am a pre-licensed counselor. I graduated from a CACREP program. So um, let's see where to start with that. So I'm postmasters. So I have my graduate degree in clinical mental health counseling. Um, but I'm pre-licensed in the state that I work in. So basically, after you graduate from a master's program, you have to jump through so many hoops in order to get licensed in that state. Mostly, it's to accrue a certain amount of hours, get a certain amount of supervision hours, and pass a clinical licensing exam. Depending on what state you work in, it varies. But so I'm in that window right now.
Mhm.
I graduated from a CACREP program.
Mhm.
CACREP, if anybody watching doesn't know what CACREP is, it's the Council for the Accreditation of Counseling and Related Educational Programs.
Mhm.
So basically, what they are, they're an accrediting body that accredits counseling programs.
Mhm.
They're kind of in cahoots with the ACA. To what extent that is, I'm not exactly
Mhm.
sure,
And
but
that's
they're
the
kind
American Counseling Association.
correct,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So like the American Counseling Association, CACREP, NBCC, which is the National Board for Certifying Counselors, and they make the testing, like the licensure exams. They're kind of all buddies. To what
Mhm.
extent and how they all affect each other, there's some influence or some friendship there to some
Mhm.
extent.
Mhm.
So CACREP accredits counseling programs. They have different standards for what those programs need to have. There's 8 common core areas.
Mhm.
And those are the same 8 common core areas that NBCC tests on
Okay.
when you get your licensing exam. Um, Now, not all counseling programs have to be CACREP accredited.
Mm.
What CACREP says is that if you go to a CACREP program, first off, it's considered higher quality. I
Mhm.
don't know by whom,
Mhm.
but they say that.
Mhm.
Okay. Whether or not that's the case, you can make the argument. At least they make the argument it's considered higher quality. But what's for certain is that your pathway to licensure, when you're in this little window that I'm in,
Mhm.
no matter what, it's definitely easier if you have gone to a CACREP program because all those hoops that I mentioned, if you
Mhm.
don't go to a CACREP program, there's a lot more hoops to jump
Mhm.
through.
You have to do more supervision hours and more
Yeah,
internship work or something.
a lot more stuff.
Mhm.
A
Mhm.
lot more stuff. You probably
Mhm.
have to take more classes, again, depending on what state you're in.
So it
Um,
streamlines the process and it gives you some sort of, it's like some little gold star
right,
on your education.
right.
Mhm.
And there's, I mean, if you look at CACREP, it's really easy to look at their website.
Mhm.
There's dozens and dozens, maybe even hundreds. I don't know. There's a lot of CACREP programs.
Mhm.
So it's not like Ivy League programs necessarily.
Mhm.
And that's not, I'm not trying to denigrate any
Mhm.
programs out there, but
Mhm.
there's a lot of schools. It's not like
Mhm.
there's a lot of schools on there that you probably don't recognize.
Mhm.
So,
So it's not
um,
it's not very exclusive. It's just one pathway a school can take.
very well said, Leslie.
Okay.
Very well said.
Antioch is CACREP accredited.
Hmm,
That's
hmm.
a tongue twister.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, they
yeah.
are.
So,
Mhm.
so I reached out to you,
Mhm.
and I think first off, I was just saying I appreciate what you're doing. I just kind of wanted to say I stand in solidarity with you.
Mhm.
Um, and we kind of exchanged a little bit, and I said, well, my program when I was in grad school was actually pretty. It was actually pretty gentle. I didn't experience a whole lot of difficulties with the material. Well, I would say in the experience I had with my
Mhm.
professors and my peers.
Mhm.
But I was more concerned with the material that was presented because going to a CACREP accredited program, it was still the material was still presented in terms of what I took issue with was um, the social justice and multicultural competencies,
Mhm.
um, which is, a weird thing to say that I take issue with that, because I think part of the modus operandi here is to couch some of these things in language that
Mm-hmm.
sounds good,
Mm-hmm.
and
Absolutely.
and we want to be good.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think underneath it has some things underneath it that aren't good.
Mm-hmm.
Because after all, who would be against social justice?
Right.
Who would be
Right.
against diversity
Mm-hmm.
or inclusion or equity? Who would be against including people or
Mm-hmm.
treating people fairly? And
Mm-hmm.
I'm certainly not against those things, but that's not all there is to those things. And I
Mm-hmm.
think in you sharing your story, that was kind of what happened to you. Is you're like, this is not what I thought was
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
what it was.
you start to realize that these are terms of art that
Hmm.
cover a concept that is not easily intuited by just looking at the cover words.
Hmm. Yeah, I think a good word for it is like a veneer, or a
Mm-hmm.
facade, even.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so the CACREP standards, I think, is what kind of instills that into the program.
Mm-hmm.
There's, again, like I said, there's 8 common core areas. One of them is called, again, it's a nice term, social and cultural diversity.
Okay.
That's one area of the CACREP standards. Now, the last time that they wrote the CACREP standards was in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
They have a new draft coming down the pipeline next year in 2024. Again, you can look this up. It's free to the public. You can go to CACREP's website. You can look at their standards that they just released a final draft. I think in November was their final draft. Or no, it was September. They stopped accepting feedback in November is what it was. Now the area on social and cultural diversity, which I think is point 2 in the Common Core,
Mm-hmm.
it's become even more. We use the word. I use the word veneer facade. It's
Mm-hmm.
become a little bit more emboldened in its language in
Okay.
2024. It's less cryptic.
Okay.
Okay, so it's
Mhm.
using, like, there's actually diversity, equity, and inclusion is in the language now.
Okay.
So I think the ability for universities that are CACREP accredited to not, or let's say, the ability for CACREP universities to have to indoctrinate their students is becoming more mandated by the CACREP standards.
Okay. So before you might have been able to get away with sort of touching on these topics
Hmm.
in your own way at a
Right.
university,
Correct.
and sort of like you said in your program, you said it was gentle.
Hmm.
And I guess I'm taking that to mean that you didn't feel like you had the ideology kind of shoved down your throat. You felt like it was touched on and mentioned, but you were free to think your own way.
So yeah, well, let me put it this way:
Mhm.
my professors weren't shoving it down our throats.
Okay.
At the same time, they weren't pulling any punches.
Okay.
Okay.
How so?
The material that was in textbooks,
Uh-huh.
which were probably the same that you'd find at any CACREP program.
Hmm.
Um, I'm not going to drop any names, but I know the names of the textbooks and stuff is probably the same that you get
Like
anywhere.
the Daryl Wing Sue book. Is that
Yeah,
something
like
you? Yeah.
I didn't have Daryl Wing Sue's book,
Hmm.
but I was presented with videos of Daryl Wing's. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
Hmm.
I mean,
Okay.
we watched videos on, microaggressions,
Hmm.
and all that
Hmm.
stuff. I mean, that
Hmm.
material was presented to us.
Okay.
He's the guy who coined the term microaggression.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And I think he's behind the whole concept of cultural competency, or at least was involved in developing
well, that
that
makes sense.
framework.
That makes sense.
I
Yeah.
I could be wrong on that, but I believe that's true.
I think you're right. I know he wrote in the 80s, he wrote a book on multicultural competency,
Hmm. Yeah, and if you
multicultural
look at
competence.
what his beliefs are, you understand how this is being informed.
Hmm. Hmm. So
Hmm.
yeah, no, he was definitely doing this really early on. And if he wasn't the
Hmm.
first to do it, he was doing it really early on.
Hmm.
So, but yeah, so I mean, it was all that sort of stuff, right?
Okay.
And so
Hmm.
we were being presented with this.
Hmm.
But I would say that if I or any of my peers said, I don't really feel that this is helpful for the clinical setting,
Mhm.
we weren't met with, well, you're a white supremacist.
Okay.
I'll just put
Yeah.
it that way. We
Yeah.
weren't met with that
So there was an actual
dialogue.
engagement and okay,
Yes,
discussion
correct,
around that. Okay.
correct.
Okay.
And I'm not saying that nobody anywhere in my program ever said anything like that,
Mhm.
but I'm I never saw anything like that.
So you don't
So
feel like it was just swallowed whole?
correct,
Okay.
correct. I think some of my peers swallowed it whole. I
Mhm.
know that some of my peers
Mhm.
swallowed it whole. But it was very my the pedagogy that my professors took was very non-directive when it came to that.
Okay. Okay.
I could
That
kind of
makes sense.
I could kind of feel a spirit of like we're gonna we're going to kind of take a non-directive approach with this.
Mhm.
Um, so
And you were telling me that you felt that one of the factors that might have insulated you somewhat was the fact that it was a Christian university.
mhm,
And so
mhm.
there maybe was a buffer there
Yeah,
between
and I
religion and ideology.
yeah, I think the ideology that's behind this is, like many people have said, this isn't my original idea. It's religion.
Mhm.
It gets into that realm of religion where you
Mhm.
question the orthodoxy, and then you get in trouble for it. You have to
Mhm.
confess your sins and all that sort
Mhm.
of thing.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think with an institution that has a foundational religious underpinning to it,
Mhm.
it would kind of be insulated, like you said, to that.
Mhm.
To that's not to say that I remember when I first applied to the university, I spoke to the director of the program, and he said, "You're going to have people in the program that are not Christians. You're going to have people in
Mhm.
the program that are Muslim. You're going to have people in the program that are Jewish, who are atheists, who are, different backgrounds. You're going to have people who are straight, who are gay, who are transgender." And we did.
Mhm.
It was not like we don't let people in who aren't Christian and toe the Christian party line or anything like
Mhm.
that.
Mhm. Mhm.
It was, to use the word in probably its appropriate term, it was diverse.
Yeah. Yeah.
In its real and its appropriate term. It was a diverse program, but I think it was insulated from the ideology itself. We could call it woke. We could call it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think probably the best term that I've heard is culturally Marxist.
Mhm.
I like cultural Marxism because I think it's just a reskinning of Marxism from an economic idea
Mhm.
to a
Mhm.
cultural idea.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, so I think that was probably one thing that kind of shielded the institution from that, and maybe, and as a result, a lot of the professorship was Christian, and so
Mhm.
maybe they weren't buying it wholesale as
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
But again, they didn't not teach it; they taught it. You know,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, but different CACREP programs, they have to meet the CACREP standards. That doesn't mean they meet it in the same way.
Okay.
So there's different. If you look at the CACREP standards, you have those common areas,
Mhm.
and then you make kind of like a course. You make a course, and then you'll say, okay, this section meets CACREP standard section 2A2.
Okay.
And then CACREP comes in. Again, this is to my understanding. Let me clarify a couple things. I think I'm not an expert in CACREP.
Mhm.
I think also the code of ethics dictates that these are my opinions. I'm not trying to be representative of the counseling profession. I think the code
Mhm.
of ethics says that I should say that at some point. These are my opinions. I'm not trying to represent the whole profession here. But essentially, different counseling education programs can meet those standards in different ways.
Okay.
Um, Now, again, you have 8 common core areas. Social and cultural diversity is one of those areas.
Mhm.
You have 8 different ones, like professional ethics.
Mhm.
One of them's like, what would be another one? Like theories. One would be to human growth and development,
Mhm.
and so on and so forth.
You just have to demonstrate that your courses are um, including elements that meet these requirements.
Yeah, so I think under each of those core sections, each of those
Mhm.
8, there's like 12 more like subpoints.
Okay, so it's
And so you have
pretty
to,
complex. You have to really be,
but it's also vague at the same
oh,
point,
okay,
at the same time,
okay,
so you can kind of meet them in different ways.
that
Now,
makes
like I
sense.
said, in the 24 CACREP standards, go look at them, it gets kind of spooky
Mhm.
because that section on social and cultural diversity is getting a little more emboldened with its diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff.
So it's really more explicit now, and it's
Uh-huh.
not as easy to make it your own in your program.
And it's spilling over into other sections.
Okay, how so?
So it's spilling over into other common core areas.
Okay, so like
As
theories might have to include like theories from marginalized voices or something like that. Okay,
right. Again, as far as I'm not an expert on it. That's as far as I can tell.
okay.
Yeah, yeah. So, and again, it's the final draft
Hmm.
is what they
So it's
have.
it's not official yet.
Right, it's not official yet. So
Hmm.
they could make a lot of changes to it. But as far as I can tell,
Hmm.
what's coming down the pipeline looks like it's becoming even more um, down the ideological rabbit hole
Mm.
in that direction.
That's something I wondered about. I have wondered about. I'm glad to have this conversation with you about this because I haven't spent a lot of time looking at those standards. I when I took ethics in my counseling program, I actually
Hmm.
took ethics twice because I took it once before my transfer and once after. And the first time I didn't complete it because I transferred in the middle of that semester.
Where did you
Um,
transfer from?
one Antioch program to another
Oh, okay.
because of my grievance with the first. I had a grievance against a professor
Okay.
from the first program. This was
Okay.
the professor. I did one video where I shared some of the papers that that I'd
Uh-huh.
written and some of her feedback.
Oh, right.
And at the end of this course, we were given a narrative evaluation, and the professor's
Right.
evaluation of me was that I needed to seek mental health care for my attitudes about race. And
Hmm.
I felt that this was a really inappropriate use of her academic authority. And it
Hmm.
was just a power play because we had a
Hmm.
disagreement about the way that the diversity information was being taught, because I
Hmm.
disagreed with the idea of race broaching and some of these other concepts.
Hmm.
Um, so the way that my grievance was handled, they dissuaded me from going all the way through the grievance process and offered me a transfer to another program.
Okay.
So anyway, when I took the ethics course, though, one of the things that jumped out at me is that this stuff is already sort of included in the ACA ethics
Hmm.
to some
Hmm.
extent. Like we had a vignette about if you are a school counselor and you have Latina, they call them Latinx or
Hmm.
Latinx, or
Hmm. Hmm.
but if you have a Latina student who comes to you and wants to drop a math class, this was one of the vignettes. If you don't first talk with her about how internalized racism and misogyny could be impacting her feelings about math, you are not demonstrating cultural competency. You're
Hmm.
not supposed to allow her to do that without first exploring issues of race and gender.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I thought, wow, this is coming from the ACA. It's not just this program that I'm in
Hmm.
where they're teaching this stuff. And
Hmm.
it it felt very anti-individualistic and
Hmm.
very just not at all what I would have pictured from counseling. So I started to be concerned that that this was top down.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I have wondered about CACREP, knowing that Daryl Wing Sue was involved in developing their cultural competency frameworks, and
That makes
knowing what
sense.
his work looks like
Hmm. Hmm.
has made me wonder what is the whole profession
Hmm.
just captive at this point.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, like we talked about earlier, the ACA and CACREP and
Hmm.
NBCC kind of all being good buddies,
Hmm.
subsets sort of each other.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean, what happens to one kind of happens to the other.
Hmm.
Um, so if this is happening to the CACREP standards, it's very likely that it'll happen to the Code of Ethics.
Hmm.
As it stands right now, the last time the Code of Ethics was revised was in 2014. That was a while ago. It
Hmm.
was pushing 11 years,
Hmm.
right? Or 9 years, I guess. That's why I'm in mental health, not math. Um, But I would be surprised if the next revision of the Code of Ethics was not much more emboldened in its language of insisting on cultural Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
I would be shocked if it didn't have much more compelled,
Mm-hmm.
because right now it's still very neutral.
And it's very contradictory as well. Like the information that you see, well, there's the little nods to cultural competency, quote
Mm,
unquote.
mm,
And, but also in there is a lot of really good information about non-discrimination and, just the way that you would hope classically trained counseling professionals would behave with their clients.
mm.
So it feels like this. I wonder how they're going to resolve the contradiction,
Oh,
actually.
I wouldn't expect that.
You think you're just going to still see the contradiction?
Well, I think in cultural Marxism, there's necessarily contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what is taught in the social justice and multicultural competency
Mm-hmm.
courses.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a handful of stereotypes, but don't be stereotypical.
That is exactly right.
But here's some stereotypes.
Right. Yes. Yeah. I have not seen more stereotyped language about racial groups than I've seen in the class that I took.
Mhm.
We're being taught just blatant
Right.
racial stereotypes. Just
Well, yeah, don't be prejudiced, but here's
Yeah.
some prejudices.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We don't want you to be bigoted, but here's some bigotries.
Yeah, that's a good way to
Mhm.
put it.
There's no way. There's really no other way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
It necessarily instills prejudices and bigotries into people. It does it under a mask of compassion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It preys upon people. People come into this profession because they're, we talk about this at the beginning of at the beginning of my counseling training
Mm-hmm.
program. We said a lot of people come into this because they're natural helpers.
Mm-hmm.
They're natural helpers. They feel kind of a draw to it because they have this compassionate and empathetic side to them.
Mm-hmm.
If they feel that way, you're going to you could be very easily preyed upon. Look at all these victimized people. Look at all these people who are being oppressed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so if you have an ideology that says, which by the way, Marxism does,
Mm-hmm.
the entire world can be conceptualized as oppressor versus oppressed,
Mm-hmm.
which, again, you can go back and read the Communist Manifesto. Not a very hard read.
Mm-hmm.
Very short. You can read it like 45 minutes. I don't know why more people don't, because of all the things that cultural Marxists and Marxists have written, it's the most coherent. It's actually pretty easy to read.
Mm-hmm.
Marx and Engels, when they write that, it's like it's like the second section when they write about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Our worldview is that all of human history can be wrapped up into oppressor versus oppressed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you read that now, you think, wow, this was written in 2023,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, yeah, I mean, it's the same issue I think we have with racism,
Mm-hmm.
because for many years we considered racism is when you have a prejudicial, you're discriminatory towards somebody based on their race. That was racism,
Mm-hmm.
right? In so many words, right? You have a prejudice based solely on somebody's race,
Mm-hmm.
and that was we don't like that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now it's something to the effect of, well, no, it's only if you have power and you're
Mm-hmm.
doing that.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have power, you can't be racist. If you're prejudiced against somebody because of their race, but you don't have power, you're not racist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, now we're talking about,
some animals are more equal than others. I mean, it's just Animal Farm.
Right. Yes. Right.
Yeah, massaging the rules
Mm-hmm.
to fit your narrative.
Correct. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So no, I don't see That's a good example of the contradictions. Some animals being more equal than others. I don't see it becoming more coherent as time goes on, unless something changes about it. Unless people say we're not happy with the way our profession is progressing, we don't like that.
Well, what does this mean for you in terms of your work, and how do you see yourself responding to this and going forward? What does this do to your career outlook, and just what are your thoughts?
I'm going to practice as long as I can. Yeah, and I'm going to tell people when I think they're doing something that is inappropriate
in terms
and
of
is
the
profession.
regulators. Yeah.
Yes. Correct. Because I don't think it helps anybody. I don't think it helps my client. I've worked with a number of different clients from a number of different backgrounds, and I never start from a point of their group identity. I've worked with individuals from in group settings, group counseling. If you've ever worked in groups, one of the biggest issues that people have coming into groups is they don't want to be minimized down to what they think group identifiers are. Okay. So if you have something like a grief group, and it's an open group, meaning that new members can come in. If you have someone new that comes in and someone says, "Oh, I understand what that's like," they'll get very defensive. If one of their peers says something like, you have someone who's been there for a while, "Oh, I understand what that's like. When my husband passed," that new member is often very, very defensive. Because not always
dismissive of the uniqueness of their process. Yeah, experience.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because they don't want to be minimized to their group identifier. You don't know me. You don't know my experience. Why would you start that? It's especially potent when you have substance abuse groups. You know, "Oh, I know what it's like to have to stop drinking." "Oh, you do you?" Right.
Oh, I know what insight.
Well, you know what it's like to be Black, do you? You know what it's like for me to have to go through what I've gone through. You know what it's like to be gay. You know what it's like to, I mean, you start from that point, you're going to lose rapport like that.
Yeah.
And for counselor educators to be suggesting that counselors start from there is absurd.
Yeah, rather than starting from a place of authentic curiosity about the other person.
But that's what you do in that group setting is you say, "Okay, so tell us what it's like for you." You know, and then you get into that and they share with the group and they open up and all the curative factors of groups, they come out. But you don't start with, "Oh no, we got you figured out.
Yeah.
We know all the stereotypes.
Yeah.
We know all the things of." Now, I mean, if any of those things apply, they'll come out, you know, but you start with the individual and it will go from there. It will go from there. If you start with the individual who's Black and they say, "I've experienced a lot of racism. This is really hard for me because you're a white counselor." Let's talk about that. Let's talk about it. Are you having a hard time with that? Let's work on that, you know? That's not to say that would never happen. But let's start there, you know, on you as an individual, rather than we talked about those training videos. Dr. Alan Ivey, who's another one of those trainers, probably up there with Daryl Wing Sue. I remember watching a video where that's where he starts with a client. Now, I think in that video, the context was she had suffered racism on campus. So maybe if somebody gets referred to you because that's why.
Okay, so it's already in the referral script.
I mean, if it's in the referral, maybe you start there.
Yeah, I could see that.
But I mean, I don't think you have to go through an entire course to be like, "Oh,
you talk about the thing that they're coming in for."
Good thing I took a 12-week course on how to figure this out, you know.
Yeah.
you know, but
Definitely.
yeah. So, but people don't like being reduced to their group identifier. You know,
No.
I work mostly with OCD at this time.
Mhm.
OCD.
Mhm.
I'm just very rarely do I see race coming into that.
Mhm.
Just it's just not a factor very
Mhm.
often.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, it seems like that's one of the myopic fallacies of this ideology is that, you know, there's so much of life that has nothing to do with these things.
mhm,
There's so much. I mean, these aspects of self, there's interplay for sure with everything else about ourself, but it's not necessary to center it the way that they,
mhm,
and that's exactly what they call for, is centering
mhm,
these
mhm,
things. Yeah.
mhm,
So, yeah, well, these are some great examples, and I appreciate the spotlight on the CACREP
mm,
standards, because this is something that I've sort of talked about, but I haven't, and I've given it a cursory glance, but I haven't looked at the new standards that are coming out, the new draft. And I'm not surprised to hear that it seems like this is just ramping up, because that's really been my sense of things.
mhm, mhm.
So,
Yeah, I'd encourage if anybody's interested is go read them.
mhm,
Again, they're still cryptic
mhm,
to some extent because
mhm.
to to some extent they have to be.
Yeah.
Um, they have to be because they can't make every university exactly the same because every
Mhm,
university has different funding. Every
mhm,
university is just different in their goals and they have different professors and so on. But to some extent, they have to be cryptic even in the diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff. Here's something. When I was doing kind of poking around the CACREP stuff, I looked into, okay, well, what have people said about the CACREP standards? What sort of
mhm,
research has been done into the CACREP standards? How effective are they in teaching?
mhm,
I
mhm.
read one paper, and this is just one thing that I read among many, where someone said, we need to be more clear in what we mean by diversity.
Hmm.
After all, that could mean that we want more men in the profession,
Hmm. Okay.
which
Not
is
that kind of diversity.
correct, right?
Yeah.
Which is very true, because it was about a 20-to-1 split in my cohort.
Wow.
In my
Wow.
cohort, um, it's it's very female dominated in the counseling
Mhm,
profession.
mhm.
But when I saw that, I was kind of like, okay, so you don't mean diversity then?
No, not no. We mean
You
something specific. We mean quotas.
right,
Yeah.
right. And I mean, I was kind of taken aback by that as a man, but
Mhm.
that's after all. I mean, what was implied and wasn't said was, and we don't want that, do we? You
Right.
know,
Mhm. Yeah. Wow.
so but the reason why they use the word diversity is because they can't say
Mhm.
we don't want white men.
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
know, they
Mhm.
can't say that. So they have to use the
It's
word
coded language.
correct, right?
Yeah.
They can't say we want more people of color.
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean, well, they could behind
Mhm.
closed doors, but they can't write that because there's language against discrimination.
It's a
Or
euphemism.
I'm sorry, there's laws against
Mhm.
hiring based on race. Like you
Mhm.
can't do that,
Yeah.
right? So it's still cryptic.
Mhm.
It has to be to some extent. Um, but I would encourage if anybody's interested in the CACREP standards to just go read them. It's
Mhm.
fairly
Mhm.
it's easy to find.
Mhm.
It's about 30 pages long.
Well, I'll
Mo-
include a link in the
yeah,
notes under this video if anybody
most of
wants
it's
to check
just
it
like
out.
logistical information of
Mhm.
like the institution. I actually didn't even read that part. I was more interested in those 8
In
common
this part,
areas,
yeah.
but a lot of it's like logistical information and stuff
Mhm.
like that. But
Mhm.
yeah, no, I would encourage people to read it, especially the new one coming down the pipeline in 2024.
Do you have any other recommendations you'd like to offer for people to check out, to learn about this stuff, or anything else that you think is important?
Read the Communist Manifesto.
Okay.
Again, not a hard read.
Mhm.
Um, read the ACA Code of Ethics.
Okay.
Not a hard read.
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't think I don't have an issue with the code of ethics.
Hmm.
I don't think. I mean, there's nothing in there that I take issue with. But again, I'd be surprised if the next one coming down the line doesn't hit me somewhere.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think it's reasonable to expect that.
Hmm.
And what about yourself? Do you have any, are you on any social media that you'd like to direct people to?
Not
They want to follow
particularly.
you?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me and
Yeah.
get into this topic and share a little bit about your experience. And I hope you're able to work, just as long as you want to and feel
Thank
that
you.
you have the freedom to practice the way that you feel ethically guided to and
Yeah.
not, without too much undue pressure. And I
Hmm.
hope you're able to continue to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. It was good talking to you.
You too.